Welcome everybody to this very unique opportunity to explore pathways to leadership. We're going to be finding out how you as school principals have developed the skills that you have for the very challenging roles you have. I want to find out what's common to your experiences, because I know a lot of you got here in very different ways. So the thing that I'm interested in is finding out, where there are common principles amongst you as a group and where there's a divergence of experience and how you've dealt with that. So a lot to talk about. Let's start today by looking at just how different the role of a principal can be from one school to another. And the first person we're going to look at is Pitzer Binion and her role in a large, growing metropolitan school.
I'm the principal of Mackinnon Secondary College. I'm in charge of a school of 2,000 students and 165 staff, 65 different nationalities. It's a very high demand school. It's a very successful school that focuses on academic success. But I had never thought that this is where my career will take me. I just loved doing what I was doing, and I think that is the most important and invaluable lesson.
So Pitzer, tell us about the main steps on your pathway to becoming a principal. If you had to identify the key things that led to where you are now, what would they be?
Well, I think that I've started in my teaching role just immersing myself into lots of positions of responsibility.
So you were one of those leader people from the beginning?
Well, others identified that in me, but really it then went from that to leading teacher, and I think that was the biggest jump of having a portfolio that I was responsible for, and it was student management that gave me my step up. I became leading teacher and then came to Mackinnon as a leading teacher and then became assistant principal, and then a vacancy arose due to the retirement of my principal, and I sort of stepped up to the principal's role. So that's how it sort of evolved.
Let's have a look now at Catherine Leo's school, which is quite a different environment.
I'm from Millikapati School, which is located on the Tiwi Islands. That's about a 25-minute flight north of Darwin. We're predominantly non-standard Australian English speaking background. A lot of the students grow up speaking Tiwi language as well as Aboriginal English on the island. We've got 80 students and that's my assistant teacher, Gabriella, working with the students. And I think that's a huge part of working in a remote context is having the assistant teachers who are from the local community and having their wealth of knowledge coming to the classrooms as well.
And how have you developed the skills to lead at a school in that environment?
So similar to Pitzer, I took on some leadership roles in my school as a classroom teacher, including coordinating our weekly newsletter for the whole school to increase literacy in our community, and leading the behaviour program, our school-wide behaviour program across the school, and coordinating days like Harmony Day, whole school events, trips to our local watermelon farm and that kind of thing. And then from there I put my hand up to go to a teaching principal role. So I'm now in my second principalship as a teaching principal.
Ben, I want to ask you a broader question, because you've done a lot of research on how to develop effective school principals. In a country like Australia, we have vastly different types of schools across the country. How much is it influenced by context?
Everything's influenced by context. Everyone has a community story that impacts what they do, I would say, on a daily basis. But when you get down to what you really need to do, and that's that focus on continually improving teaching and learning, that's a constant throughout all schools across the country and probably all schools throughout the world. doesn't matter what the context, it's that incredible focus on teaching and learning and how to lead that. And it's not easy. Context makes it more difficult, but even in the most wonderful school, it's still a very difficult job. And the context can make it more difficult, can make it more challenging, but that constant notion of improving teaching and learning, it's actually really hard work, but it's a constant in every school.
And how much impact do principals, as opposed to teachers, have on students' achievement, do you think?
Principals enable teachers to learn. They help them get better. They create an environment, they create the strategy, the atmosphere, the resources that enable great teachers to improve. Really, if you want to get a school moving forward, if you want teachers to improve and develop over time, they need a great leader. And that's the same in every school, no matter what the context. And I would say in every organisation, in every industry. It's the same. We need great leaders for us all to get better.
Everyone's nodding. You all agree with that? Yeah, okay.
Not many school principals disagreed with that one. Yeah.
Paul, you were appointed as a principal when you were just 31. Had you always wanted to do it?
I wouldn't say I've always wanted to do it. I trained as a primary teacher and started my career in a small independent school in country New South Wales. But pretty early on in my career, I set a goal for myself to be principal or head of a school by 30.
How early on?
Probably the first 3-4 years, I would suggest. So, yeah.
Okay, so years before, you set the goal.
I set the goal.
At 30.
Yep.
Okay, and how old were you when you got the job?
31. I missed it by 1 year. So a bit disappointing, but.
Okay, and so you had a plan. Did the plan go to plan, or?
I didn't have a plan in my head, but certainly there was things I knew I needed to do. Because I was so young, there were things that I needed to actually to do to get the experience and the credibility to be considered for the role. So, bit like Pizza, putting my hand up for doing different things around the school, leading school camps, coming up with new initiatives and leading those, opportunities for leadership positions. I actually went and asked the boss at the time, can I actually do that? Could you consider me for this? And then the other thing that I did a master's degree in educational administration. So it was really important for me to have some credibility behind me, and having that qualification was a good thing to have.
Jeff, did you have leadership aspirations from the beginning?
Yes, I did, from the very beginning, and one of the main reasons for that was my father was a principal, and so I travelled around the countryside.
This is a fairly common story. There's smiles going around here.
And I guess what I tried to do in my first 5 to 10 years was to become a competent teacher in different educational contexts or settings. So when it was right for me to move into administration, I knew I had the curriculum knowledge and the interpersonal skills to work with people. So it was just, and hence I went to many different towns on that pathway, and worked with wonderful people that assisted me in developing my own leadership style.
Caroline, you've only just started as a principal. Was it always your plan to be where you are?
Not initially. I've done 14 weeks in a school with about 900 students, and certainly a similar story to Pizza in that when I first had a teaching, obviously there were things that you would grab hold of as a natural leader initially in the classroom, and took opportunities very early on, and also had opportunities identified for myself. But certainly as I moved into coordinators positions and curriculum leadership, it was those challenges, and I think the absolute privilege to be driving improvement in schools that I did identify then early on that I wanted to actually be a principal. And actually took those opportunities on. Do you feel you were prepared for it? Or absolutely. Has it been a shock just how much there is? No, I think for me, and particularly about targeting the point where I was ready to apply for principal's positions, my real focus was about intentional leadership, even when I was an assistant principal. So my headset very much was approaching it as if I was a principal and challenging myself with that. So I think the biggest challenge for new principals is with those 20 different hats, about the buck does stop with you, and about being able to make those really clear decisions each day. And yes, I felt in the last term that I've attempted to do that. Michael, you're an acting principal now. But you've had leadership roles, always had leadership roles of one kind or another, which is a bit of a recurring theme here. Have you always wanted to be a principal? Did you have a plan?
Well, maybe not on the first day, but it became clear fairly early on that...
As a teacher?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was passionate about teaching. I think, being surrounded by really inspirational leaders and seeing the impact that they had on education and on students, I wanted to be that leader.
And you got a big break when the acting head teacher won Powerball. Is that right?
I did. So I think it was my third or fourth year of teaching, and the school had recently appointed an assistant principal, and she entered the school on day one. It was a Thursday, and she bought her Powerball ticket that day. That presented the opportunity for me to step up in a new school and take on that role very early on in my career. So,
and you've got to be willing to do that when those opportunities arise. Yeah, you've got to grab them when
absolutely.
They're there. Sue, you had a principal in Darwin who encouraged you to have a go. Tell us about that.
So I was a senior teacher in an urban school in Darwin, and the opportunity arose to follow my principal into a town situation where we were based in the office and went out to remote communities. And he inspired me to come out of my comfort zone of leading curriculum, etc., in an urban context and go and learn about the bush. And it grew from there.
What about those of you who didn't have plans and who didn't, see this necessarily as your career or the way that you'd go? How did you get to where you are? Yes.
Yeah, look, I suppose I was a pretty reluctant principal in the end. I got into teaching because I loved working with students and getting the most out of students. And I guess the role models I had were always principals who were stuck in their office, had a queue of staff, parents, student issues to manage. And it was just something that I wasn't interested in. But again, as the stories that we've been hearing, you continue to take that next opportunity. You see a way that you can have a broader impact on more students outside of that context.
So why were you reluctant? I'm interested in that because some people watching this might be in that category. I mean, what process went on for you to go from being reluctant to... I mean, you've explained it partially, but I wonder if there are other things or people who helped you in that?
I think you're unaware of what the job really entails. I think it's the unknown that probably scares you the most, in the sense of, am I ever really ready? There's all these things that I'm not really sure of what's going on. In a lot of ways, it turns out that the way you manage students and the way that you lead your classroom is directly transferable to how you lead staff, and then is directly transferable to how you lead a school. Whilst the expectations and responsibilities are vastly increased, I think the skills are completely transferable too, and it was only with support of people who knew me really well who said, no, you are ready, and look, worst comes to...
people pushing you by the sound of it, really.
And if worst comes to worst and it doesn't work out, it's 6 months and someone else will come in and fix up all your mistakes, and it's not too bad. So, and so again, it ended up being very, very reluctant, but very glad I was pushed in the end.
Shane, when did you realise that you could be a principal?
I reluctantly went into teaching as a casual teacher to start off with, and within about a week I discovered that it was really what I wanted to do. So I kept rolling with that, but I had to spend something like 6 or 7 years doing casual teaching in blocks within a couple of schools, because the area I was living in didn't have any permanent positions. And as a consequence, that actually was a benefit down the track, because it meant that I had the time to be able to hone my practice. I was getting that feedback, because if you weren't doing a good job, you just didn't end up with work. And that's a really telling way to look at your practice constantly. From there, an opportunity came up for promotion in the learning difficulties area, and I had found that that's what I was really interested in. And I had a boss at that stage who called me into his office to have the chat. You know how we have the feedback chats? And he said, have you ever thought about being a principal? And at that stage I hadn't. And he said, well, I think you need to really have a think about it and come back to me and have a talk about it when you've decided what it is that you want to do. And that's where it started. And when I think back now, there were a lot of mentors along the way who provided opportunities. So those opportunities were taken regardless of what they actually were, and they added to every bit of learning that was done that gets used even today.
I'm sure a lot of people watching are going to feel glad to hear that casual teaching positions can have a good outcome, as opposed to just being a frustration that you can't get a permanent job. Interesting that you used that time the way you did. Simon, do you want to say?
Yeah, my story is really similar. If you listen to my mum, I was going to be a teacher at third grade as well, but I was determined I wasn't going to be a teacher, and then the first school I started at was quite a tough school. Nobody really wanted to stay at this particular school. I left it 14 years later from the first day I walked in, and it was a series of casual jobs for the first 3 years. This was a period of time, I think, when leadership was less skilled, less well prepared, there was less mentoring, there was less coaching for you. And then along the way, I had fantastic principals, real genuine role models that pushed me to that next step and then that next step. And I think just a word for the DPs as well, because that's a pretty tough gig. I did that for 12 years before I became a principal, and I think honing your craft there is a really important stage as well.
Leonie, you've gone from being a principal to providing professional learning programs, and there's this thing called professional companioning that you're involved in, and it's a sort of key part of your leadership program. Can you explain what it is?
So part of what we offer in the Leadership Centre, which people are finding very helpful, is professional companioning. And the idea is somebody walks with rather than tells you how to do something. And it's a very holistic concept that's very much focused on the person of the leader, not their career, not helping them to solve a particular problem, the whole person. So the elements of that are some coaching, some mentoring, critical friend, strategic co-planner, and ultimate purpose partner.
Anyone had somebody like that who's really influenced them in a significant way? Yes.
Yes, as part of my new leaders induction program in the first year of my principalship, we were offered a coaching program. It was really difficult to make the decision to take that up because in your first year you just simply don't have time to do anything that you feel might be additional to the already complex role that you're doing. Best decision I ever made to do that. I was lined up with a mentor who was absolutely fantastic. She was actually a chief executive of a company, and we had conversations, so there were phone conversations that we had, and there was also some other work that was required, and being in a remote school, being able to be mentored by somebody via phone call was hugely beneficial. It meant not having to be out of my school in my first year, and it was lots of ways in which I could be coached along the way in my first year. It was fantastic.
Jonathan, did you have role models?
Absolutely, yes. Past principals that I worked with going through my career really were very strong reference points for me. As much as anything, to be able to say those particular elements of their style really resonate with me, and there were some that didn't, obviously, as well. And I think that would be the key bit for me would be to find that way to be entirely true to yourself, because the role of principal is so demanding that you can't act it. You can't be anyone other than completely yourself.
Yeah, Neil, and then yes.
Yeah, thanks. As a principal myself, over 10 years, I had an approach where I actually shared my office with my assistant principal, so taking it from the other side, and that was a great opportunity for them. I think I had 4 assistant principals that went on to be principals, and I think that was partially because we were able to work together and I was able to role model the things that happened, and I think that prepared them better for the role when they actually went into it.
Stephen?
I actually didn't have the mentors. I didn't actually have people that I aspired to be because they just didn't exist. And but I guess it gave me an extremely firm commitment to saying change shouldn't take years, it should take days. And so I guess I started to look outside of education into the business world to say, well, how do companies manage agility and change? And I think I really go back to what Pitzer said at the start. The more we can individually initiate from ourselves, an opportunity came up, you take it going through. And I think in the business world, that's often what actually happens. And I think, I guess from my perspective, it's now very important that I give back as a mentor to as many people as I can, because I recognise that there is a lack of mentorship in many schools, and I think the idea of actually locating ourselves in large teams is important, just as they would in the business world as well.
What about formal leadership training? How important, how significant has that been in people's careers? Michael?
I guess for me, the two have always been completely linked. So Teach for Australia, their whole ethos, I suppose, in terms of bringing professionals into the teaching profession, making that career change, is that teaching is leadership, that the skills of leadership that you might have built up in a different profession are absolutely transferable over into the classroom, and then therefore back into the corporate world or further up through school leadership or whatever that might be. So the 2 years that we're considered an associate, while we're doing our training, we're observed, we're given feedback. Essentially, we have a leadership coach who watches us and gives us that feedback. So my doors have always been open.
Catherine, like Michael and Caroline, you're at the beginning of your career as a principal. Is it all on the job learning, or are you getting formal support as well, formal training?
As a classroom teacher taking on those additional responsibilities in the school, I had the opportunity to do a course called Preparation for School Leadership. All the time you're applying what you're learning in the school through what they call a change challenge project. So you identify something you're going to work on, but they also provide you lots of opportunities to learn the administrative side of things, but also to build your leadership capacity.
Neil, you're leading a professional learning institute. How do your programs prepare principals for the role, do you think?
We have quite an intentional and strategic approach, really. It's about building the leadership pipeline, so it's about getting leaders to think about leadership early in their career. So that we do that in two ways. We have specific programs, career stage programs, or what we call signature programs, so a program for emerging leaders. But then as well as that, we have a range of programs to build people's skills and capabilities and knowledge around a range of things, leading literacy, leading numeracy. And then there are a range of other opportunities for people to do things about how to have difficult conversations, so workshops around that.
What about gaps in skills? Has anyone specifically targeted gaps in skills? I think you have, Simon, yeah?
So I actually used the standards, the Australian Standards for School Leaders, and had a good look at some of the things I felt I needed to develop, because I'm still only 2 years into my principalship, and I think you continue to learn, as other people have said. So some of those standards identified things for me with engaging with the community and leading the management of the school in particular. In the ACT, we've been slowly moving towards more empowered, autonomous school budgeting. So one of the things that highlighted to me was perhaps the skills need there and learning to do more of the financial management of the school.
Caroline, was the standard helpful to you in developing your approach?
Yeah, very similar story. I probably not was floating along, but was certainly in leadership and grabbing opportunities as they come along with the goal that I did want to eventually be a principal. And I probably got to a point where I thought I probably need to be serious about this and identify some areas that I needed to work on to start applying for principals positions. And certainly aligning resources was one of the areas that I did identify, but certainly the 8 till Principal Centres gave me the opportunity to actually really structure and I guess set some goals for myself to actually get into a position where I could apply for principal positions.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because you have to know yourself pretty well to, is that right? Like, do you have to take a good hard look at yourself, as my mother used to say? Monique, you had a principal who thought you had what it takes and gave you a lot of responsibility but not a whole heap of coaching, as I understand it. Describe what that was like and how you coped with that.
This particular principal showed a lot of trust in me and gave me a lot of key responsibilities in leading the instructional leadership of the school, taking on that main role. But she was at a stage in her career where she was being asked to go off and do some other things for our department. And she showed a great deal of trust in me, and so did the department at that time, to leave me in charge of the school in her absence. And she had quite a few of those absences. And it wasn't that she didn't coach me. She was still at the end of the phone or the end of the email, but she wasn't there micromanaging me, and she let me take risks and let me make mistakes. And what I learned in her absence was that there was a whole nother part of the job that I didn't really realise existed, that she did so seamlessly, around staffing and budgets and occupational health and safety and managing buildings. And so it opened up my eyes to the fact that this was a really very big job. And what I was very fortunate about in that time while she was away was we had a great network of principals in our cluster of schools who were on the end of their email and on the end of their phone and would give advice without judgment around some of those really basic questions that you have when you're stepping into an acting principal role, you know, where to find things, what to write in your newsletter, how to word things. And I found that grounding of that acting position, what that gave me really held me in good stead when I took up my own first principalship.
Shane, you run the Thrive induction program for new principals in Tasmania. How are you tackling the issue of learning on the job? I mean, we're hearing stories of people thrown into things they didn't necessarily expect.
So our Thrive program aims to give beginning principals their best possible start into the principalship. Whilst the program is actually based on the AITSL principal standards, we have a strong focus on praxis, which is theory into practice. So we use a few components that bring that really practical element into the program. One of them is around the power of story, and we ask principals to come and tell their stories related to a particular professional practice. But we deliberately choose principals of only second or third year out in their leadership, so they can still relate to a beginning principal.
Nairi, you work in the APY lands on the WA South Australian Northern Territory border. Do you need different skills?
I'm not so sure that the skills need to be different, but some skills become more important than others. One of the skills that I've found particularly important is the need to build collective teacher efficacy, because they work in such challenging and sometimes traumatic conditions.
Esther and Sue, you were nodding, listening to quite a lot of what Nairi was saying, and I'm just really interested in your roles, because you're co-principals. You share the responsibility, don't you? How do you think the relationship with Sue has changed over time, Esther?
Well, when she did first come into 2010, not 11, teaching, that's when I said, here, take the reign, be a principal for a while I'll step back. So you could find all the difficulties what I have been going through.
Yeah, and why did you decide to do that? Why did you decide to?
Well, I just want her to get the feel of what it's like being alone in a remote with no such support. So let her feel the isolation being on her own.
And then she'll understand better how to work with you.
And she'll understand better of where I'm coming from through my principalship.
Was that hard for you to make that decision, to say to her, go, you do it?
No, I think I've been practicing before.
I bet you have. Jenny, you have a background in educating children with disabilities. How does that shape you as a principal?
For me, the pathway to the principalship was a little different. So my driver was engaging in a profession that supported people with disabilities, and education was the vehicle to do that. So 20 years from beginning teaching to my first principal position, but during that time I had 2 years overseas as an Australian volunteer in a school for students with disabilities. I had 6 years in central office, both policy around disability, but also mainstream and regular education policy. And I also had a year or two away from education, but working in the area of disability. So when I came to the principalship, my pedagogy was really strong. My vision was really strong, and because I'd been in the department, my knowledge of management structures was really strong, but I hadn't been a leader of people. And so when I stood up in front of my staff of 50 on the first day and introduced myself as a principal and their new school leader, I realised I had a real lot to learn about leadership of people, although my understanding of disability was really strong.
Iris, what have you learnt about yourself?
I think in my first year as principal, we might have had 2 assistant principals and no principal, because I think we were both running around the school trying to micromanage things, be visible everywhere, etc. And I've since learnt that it's my job to keep my eye on the big picture and check the coordinates of the direction that we're travelling and make sure that it's always about the students.
So that's a reference point for you.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
I knew that I was ready to apply for principal positions when I was absolutely focused on students with no matter what decision I was making. So I absolutely agree with those points.
Social responsibility, just listening to those stories about that sense of social responsibility, do other people connect with that, Peter?
We've talked a bit about how the community can impact upon your life as a principal. I think if we're prepared to open our schools up to the support agencies we've got in our community, I think that has a huge social impact on the community you're in.
I think a recurring theme I'm hearing, which is incredibly important as you think into the future, relational strength is critical for a leader. And if you know that you have any deficit in relationship creation or being able to place yourself as a neutral person into conflict, you've actually got to actually learn those skills.
What about, let's just go back to the idea of supporting aspiring leaders. Neil, you've done a lot of work around identifying talent early. Tell us about that, the work you've done.
So part of our journey is to look at this pipeline and pathway, even from our pre-service teachers and working with our higher education institutes, all the way through to our coaches and mentors that look after our experienced teachers. So our pipeline is really shaping up in a continuum based around the framework from AITSL and the professional standards, and identifying and helping people to come through this pipeline well prepared.
Ben, what do you think the most important thing that leaders can do to encourage others?
I think there's actually a few things. One is to provide them with the opportunities to actually make a difference, to provide them with opportunities to actually lead groups of people. I think the other thing is actually to do with that notion that we talked about of there's a lot of stories, there's a lot of narrative about the great teacher who makes a great difference. We've actually got to, I think, change the narrative a bit to actually say that's also true and perhaps even more true for school leaders.
Yeah.
Really, I think one of the most important things for principals is to actually identify that talent really early and enable it, and really be flexible in that way. And
often
really
when the person themselves hasn't seen it. I mean, there's been examples here of that.
Absolutely.
What do you all wish you'd known before you got the job? Karen?
I think just how joyful it really is. I think we do hear the war stories a lot. I think people share those a lot. But I think it's constantly a surprise to me, even on those hardest days, that you can find one child or one teacher or something that you've made a difference to. So I think we should encourage aspiring leaders to think about the joy that you can get from this. It sometimes is surprising.
Nari?
Yes, I absolutely concur. I wish I'd known what a wonderful experience it is, because I would have put my hand up for it much, much earlier than I did.
Interesting. Anyone else?
Yeah, exactly the same. I think it's an amazing job, and if I'd have known that earlier, I would have jumped earlier.
Very good note to end on. Thank you all very much, so much, for sharing all your stories. I hope it inspires a lot of people watching this to take up the reins of being a school principal. Thank you.